Welcome to Just Healing, where we rediscover humanity and our conversations around trauma and celebrate all the unique ways we love and heal. I'm one of your Season 2 co-hosts, Michael Munson. Trauma doesn't exist in a bubble, and healing shouldn't either. Let's listen, let's learn, let's heal.
I'm interested in reducing violence in society broadly, right? So men, women, non-binary people, kids, adults, everyone deserves to be violence-free. We're at a point now where there's just decades of research showing that all people can be victims and all people can be perpetrators. Healing from violence is going to look different depending on who you are.
Whether it's physical aggression in relationships, sexual assault, psychological aggression, cyber aggression, we want to have as thorough of an understanding of the etiology of it so that we can be in a better position to have informed treatments and so that we can know what to target.
Hey everybody, I am Michael Munson. This is the next episode of Just Healing. I'm one of your Season 2 co-hosts. This is another week, and we have another set of guests. I teased with people that it's a 2-for-1 special, so I'm joined today by Ryan Shorey and Greg Stuart, and we are going to have a fun time talking about academic stuff and research and lots of really interesting things. How about you tell us who you are, what you do, just a little bit about you.
All right, so we'll start with the elder. So, it occurred to me that I have been studying intimate partner violence for an astoundingly long period of time. I started graduate school in the early 1990s. So it's been well over 30 years that I've been studying intimate partner violence. And I wonder if we'll be talking about how just the concept of intimate partner violence has evolved over time, because we didn't used to call it intimate partner violence. When I started in this field, it was marital violence or it was husband violence. And on rare occasion, it was male to female violence, but there was no acknowledgement of any other party in being involved in the aggression. But in any case, so it started for me 30 some odd years ago. And I felt like when I was in graduate school, I had really excellent training in all things that were related to intimate partner violence. But I really felt like the biggest piece that was missing for me in terms of an understanding of violence was that I didn't have much background in substance use, alcohol use, drug use issues. And I felt that to have a better understanding of intimate partner violence, it would be wise for me to gain a background in substance use disorders. So I went from my graduate program to Brown University, where I did an internship. I did a research postdoctoral fellowship on addictions, and then my career kind of launched from there in terms of looking at the intersection between alcohol use and intimate partner violence, and then kind of evolved from there. I'm now a professor at University of Tennessee, and I am also the director of the clinical psychology graduate training program here at UT.
That was the elders intro. What about the student younger?
Yes. I appreciate you having us, Michael. I'm here in Milwaukee with you. I'm at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And I've been here since 2018 as a faculty member. I'm an associate professor in psychology. And I said Greg was my mentor because I did grad school at the University of Tennessee under his mentorship for 5 years, where everything I know about intimate partner violence comes from Greg. And so this is year 18, I think, for me, focused on studying intimate partner violence. And before here, before being at UWM, I was a faculty member at Ohio University for 4 years, and then did my internship in Charleston, South Carolina, and undergrad in Michigan, and grew up in Illinois. So I've been all over the place over the past 18 years, um, and have appreciated getting to work with all of you over the past few years on some cool projects, which I hope we get to talk about today.
Now, and I'll throw out one other thing that will be abundantly clear to anybody who's listening or watching this podcast. Dr. Shorey is absolutely one of those cases where the mentee so vastly outshines the mentor that it's a privilege now for me to be in the same podcast. But Ryan is absolutely just to say Ryan is that good is an insult to Ryan Shorey. So his resume is ablaze with magnificent accomplishment after magnificent accomplishment.
You know, I wanted to circle back, Greg, to one of the things that you said about language, and I think this really relates a lot to Men Healing, who really focuses on sexual harm, sexual violence, sexual abuse, and you and Ryan both work more in IPV, intimate partner violence, than in sexual assault. But you talked about language and how it's evolved, and I think that's really linked to gender. Do either one of you want to talk? I mean, Greg, if you want to start with that, since you brought it up, you know, why do you think it's changed? Do you think it's changed for the better, language? How do men fit into the equation now or not?
You know, society has evolved a lot in the last 30 some odd years. And I think historically, there was a sort of a feminist perspective that dominated the field, at least with respect to intimate partner or what was then marital violence or husband violence. But I out of habit, now refer to it as intimate partner violence. But you know, in the past, violence was viewed as men using this tactic to oppress, dominate, subjugate women. That any violence that was perpetrated by a woman would have been considered self-defense. But sort of this idea of women as perpetrators of violence was quite foreign back then, and I understand it from a historical perspective. You know, I understand it, right? That like it's on average, men have greater size and strength than do women. That the consequences of intimate partner violence perpetrated by men can often be more dire, right? Women are more likely to be injured, maybe more likely to take time off of work, things like that. And so I completely understand that perspective. But at the same time, intimate partner violence, men do not have a monopoly on that, and that there's a lot of different kinds of aggression. You know, maybe we'll get into that, maybe we won't. But violence begets violence. There's a lot of reciprocity in violence, where you know sometimes it can be challenging to ascertain in any given case who was the perpetrator and who was the victim, and you know there can be women can initiate violence. In fact, there was a meta-analysis that came out that was a classic that showed that women were actually slightly more likely than men to initiate violence. And you know, I am not trying to ascribe this problem to either gender. You know, I think Ryan would agree that a huge part of our professional lives is devoted to trying to figure out how we can make this world a more peaceful, less violent place with better relationships. But I also don't think we're doing anyone any favors, and we're doing anyone any favors, at least at this point, by ignoring the fact that violence in some cases, and I want to be clear, there are certainly some cases where it is unidirectional male to female violence, and that the violence in some relationships is absolutely, when used by women, only in self-defense and so on. But that the presumption in the 80s and 90s, I think, was that the overwhelming majority or all of the violence was kind of like that. And from my perspective anyway, I think the thinking has shifted to suggest that, in fact, both genders can be perpetrators and both genders can be victims.
Greg, when you were talking about like the different language, my early language of what I was learning was battered women or battered women syndrome. And so it brought up both, who the gender was that was getting harmed, but it also brought up that it was like physical violence. And, we know that intimate partner violence or sexual violence is oftentimes much, much, much more than physical violence. That's usually like the small part of it. So, I'm glad you brought up both the dynamics of kind of which direction, but it's not just about physicality.
I'm interested in reducing violence in society broadly, right? So men, women, non-binary people, kids, adults, everyone deserves to be violence free. And so, I think over time, our academia especially has been slow to change what we've done, and as language evolves and our understanding evolves, the research is kind of slow to catch up. And so we're at a point now where there's just decades of research showing that all people can be victims and all people can be perpetrators of intimate partner violence, and that healing from violence is going to look different depending on who you are, and the experiences you had, whether it was physical violence or sexual violence or emotional or financial abuse, right? There's so many different forms that it can take, that if we ignore men's experiences with being victims of violence, we're missing a huge portion of the population who has these traumatic experiences and deserve healing just like anybody else who's been through violence. So, we've come a long way since maybe it was in 1979 when this research kind of really started to gain some traction. But I'm sure we'll talk about, we still have a long, long way to go. And research-wise, we're still, I think, quite a bit behind. We have a lot of catching up to do.
The research suggests that people tend to find the psychological aggression to be more damaging, more harmful to their mental health, than even physical. Now, I don't know that they've done as much comparison when it comes to like sexual aggression, but certainly between physical, like the thought is that my bruises may heal, but I can't forget the way I was treated.
And I think that goes to the kind of the catchphrase in both fields, which is, things are about power and control. So it's not about the physicality so much as it is about what's the kind of the motivating, kind of the impetus for the violence that's happening or the harm that's happening. So is it about trying to control somebody? Is it about trying to, exert something over someone more so than what the tactic is that's used? So, I mean, there's a lot of different tactics that people can use, and sometimes it's physical, but a lot of the times it's not. So you both are researchers. That's kind of become clear. Why is research important?
I think for a lot of reasons, especially if we stick with intimate partner violence, going back to the last discussion we just had, if we didn't have research, I think the field would be stuck on this as a male to female problem. If we're, and that kind of started with, a lot of police reports being, male to female and shelters seeing more women. And so without research asking people, in a safe, confidential way what's going on, and seeing that, everyone who experiences violence isn't reporting it. Most people aren't reporting it. We're missing a huge segment. So from that basic level, I think it's important to get a more accurate snapshot of what's happening in people's lives. And then, hopefully, as we go through today, I'm sure we'll talk about ways to heal and ways to prevent violence. And Greg and I are big on finding empirically supported ways to help people heal and recover and prevent violence. And by that we mean ways we know through research work. So not just anecdotal reports, but controlled studies that can hopefully test the effectiveness of an intervention or a way to heal after trauma.
Greg, you have thoughts on lots of things. What are your thoughts?
Any given individual research study is probably flawed in a number of important ways. We're also very big believers in being guided by science, and that rather than just presuming because there was an anecdotal report of something being helpful. I think Ryan and I would say, hey, look, that's a great place to start. That's a great place to generate hypotheses, generate evidence. But well, we'd be a lot more compelled to do that intervention if we could subject it to some randomized uh, controlled trial where people are getting that suggested intervention versus another one. We want to get as thorough of an understanding of the etiology of whether it's physical aggression in relationships, sexual assault, psychological aggression, cyber aggression. We want to have as thorough of an understanding of the etiology of it, so that we can be in a better position to have informed treatments and so that we can know what to target.
And as you were both talking, I was thinking that, like, who knows about research, right? So, like, you all do research. It gets published in academic journals. Other academics read that research. But how does that get into practice? Like, so the advocate that works at the shelter, or the law enforcement folks who go on site and they see two people that are arguing, pick the genders, pick the whatever. How does it get from research into the hands of people that need to know the information that you're finding out?
Yeah, that's a good question, and a huge problem because I think there's that gap, and there's some studies that suggest broadly within, let's say, psychology, that intervention research takes on average like 5 to 10 years to even get out into the community, right? So there's this huge lag, um, and so using our own experience, I think it's great. Like, we work with you, Michael, and Forge on a lot of our work. And so trying to disseminate that research directly to the partners in the community who are trying to prevent violence is one way. And hopefully is the way of the future, and probably the best way. But a lot of times that research, as you said, gets published, and then it's just kind of left sitting there, hoping that the community will see it. And so there needs to be a bit more, there needs to be more effort from academics like ourselves to connect with community members who are on the ground, seeing everybody, right? I mean, that's what we need to do more of, and form these really close partnerships where we're bouncing ideas off of each other. And that's getting better, I think, broadly. We still have a long way to go, but again, if we're taking the historical view of IPV, back in the 70s, 80s, 90s, that was rarely happening. And now in 2024, it's happening much more, but still probably a fraction of what it should be.
And I think it takes change agents like you, Michael, because if I'm being perfectly honest here, I absolutely could, and I would even argue should, do more public dissemination into forum like this to get the word out. And it took the initiative of a social change agent leader, visionary such as yourself, to pull Ryan and I out of our ivory tower long enough to share the message. And I'm grateful that there are folks like you that are out there that are helping us to get the word out, and maybe even pulling our teeth to get the word out. But that really needs to happen because otherwise, as Ryan suggested, the gap, the delay between from there's already, as you know from doing the work with us with IRBs and study designs and data collection and data analysis and write up and submitting to journal and getting feedback and resubmitting and then there are even publication delay. But from the time we had the idea for the study until the time it hits the street is already a super long time. And then tack on another 10 years until Michael invites us onto the podcast. So,
hey, Men Healing is really committed to bringing new ideas in and sharing knowledge. So it's like, I mean, this is part of what we're doing, right? Is bringing knowledge to people that they may not have. And part of that is research. And I was thinking that too, that, both of you teach, and it's like, I'm sure that what you do in your research side of your life comes into the classroom. And those classrooms are full of people that maybe, become therapists or may become substance use, not providers, but, like folks that work with folks that have substance use issues. And so it's, that's another way that I see for both of you. But I was, Ryan, I was a little bit surprised that you were like, it's 5 to 10 years. Cause I was going to be more like 10 to 20 years to actually have that change, kind of be seen and felt. So
the other thing that crossed my mind as we were talking about this, and we go back to language, right, is there's been so much distrust too, I think, of academia and research, given the historical harms done through various research studies and exclusion of people in our research, that it makes sense that folks in the community may not seek us out for information or have trust in the information that we are putting out. And as language has evolved to be more inclusive, and that has resulted, I think, in our research studies being more inclusive, I think that'll help, because the voices of the people who need the help are being heard more, and hopefully that'll be reflected more in the work. So it's a long haul, right? To me, it's a long haul game. It's we wish it could be. I know Greg and I talk about this a lot. Like, we wish it could be quicker. And here I am, year 18, and I don't think violence has gotten any better in society, but our understanding of it has, and hopefully in the next 18 years, we'll actually start seeing reductions in it. So
one of the things that Men Healing does is they've got an evaluation program, which is not the same as research, but it's collecting data about what and how healing is happening with folks. And, it's like, that's a body of work that's different than what you all do, but it's all important. It all kind of adds up to the same, kind of the same storytelling of what is violence, how do we heal from it, what's resilience, and all of those pieces. And I know that, we're partnered on some projects, and, from coming from a community and a trainer perspective versus a researcher, I really care about getting the word out.
And, Michael, I think a lot of this starts with trust, right? That I think, and that Ryan was alluding to earlier as well, that we feel so fortunate that we were able to build a relationship with you where you could trust us to partner with us, to know that it's not my voice, it's not Ryan's voice, it's our voice, and that we know that your content matter, and you're an expert, and we value you, and we're not going to undermine you, and we're like, this is a partnership. When I was in Rhode Island, we did, and Ryan was involved with these studies later. What we did a bunch of work with batterer intervention programs. I think back to how you were talking about the language, right? They were among them, it was batterers. And in fact, every state in the United States has batterer intervention programs. And when somebody is arrested for a domestic violence, if there's probable cause and they don't have a too lengthy of a criminal history, in lieu of going to jail, they're probably going to go to a batterer intervention program. And a lot of batterer intervention programs were very hesitant to letting research be done on them, because the previous research that had been out there just suggested that they have questionable efficacy. And so what good does it do to let some researcher come in and show what I'm doing isn't working, that is affecting my livelihood, my bottom line, and I don't, and I'm not sure that I can trust you. And so when I was at Brown, it took a long time to build relationships and build trust to say, hey, we, we're not here to say what, doesn't work. What we're here to do is try and figure out ways that we can maximize the likelihood that people will have, less aggression, less violence, and better outcomes. And I think when you build that trust and people understand your true intentions and that you're not going to undermine what they're going to do, but you're going to partner with them to sing louder, together. And I think that's sort of what we aspire to do with our community partners.
And it's interesting when you say that, like people are kind of worried that it's going to take away their livelihood if somebody comes in with good intentions of trying to make something better. And it's like, I would love if all of the folks that work in, anti-violence fields were out of a job because there wasn't enough violence happening. I mean, that would be super.
It always baffles me when folks don't want their programs evaluated, and it happens a lot. And it's just kind of, if we're not doing folks a service if we're giving them something that we don't know if it actually works, right? We're just wasting everybody's time and effort and resources, and in the worst case scenario, giving them something that's actually detrimental to them. Right? I mean, look at DARE. I mean, we could go into the research on DARE. DARE doesn't work. It actually made kids more likely to use substances. And there's some research with batterer intervention programs that actually suggested violence might have increased after these programs, right? And so we need to be, I think, very mindful and careful, that we're not making things worse for people, and be open to the idea that we don't know everything. I mean, we don't know everything. I don't know everything. The three of us together don't know everything, but the three of us together is better than one of us alone.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting. I mean, we can look at things like, prison reform. Like, yeah, there's a punishment element to it, but there's not a restorative element. It's not teaching people skills. And it's the same with, the batterers programs, which I cringe every time I hear that language, because it's just like, why do we need to talk about it that way? Yeah, I mean, behavioral change is what I think we want to have happen with those programs. And we don't usually help people realize that they have their own trauma, and that may be part of why they're behaving abusively. And so, like, when we kind of stigmatize people into these groups, we don't look at their wholeness.
Well, we're trying to fit these programs within the context, if we're sticking on batterer intervention, in the context of state laws that, in some states, and Greg knows more about this than I do, some states don't let you talk to folks in these programs about alcohol or drug use, or you have to be really careful with how to regulate emotions, because they feel that is you're excusing the violence, right? And we're viewing it as, no, we're not excusing the violence. You're responsible for your violence. But if you're more likely to be violent when you're drinking, we need to talk to you about the fact that you're more likely to be violent when you're drinking. And so maybe it's a good idea that we focus on reducing your drinking. But, some of the state laws kind of handcuff you in what you can and can't talk about in these programs. And that's just not, we just know that's not how people change, right? It's not one size fits all. With these programs, I think, are intended to be one size fits all. And that's just not how people are. People aren't one size, right? People are diverse with different experiences, like you said, Michael, and different life histories and traumas that need to be addressed, to heal as a person. And hopefully that can help reduce violence.
What you just said is kind of like, it's a chicken or an egg thing. I mean, from my experience and my knowledge, it's like, a lot of survivors of whatever type of violence oftentimes use alcohol or drugs as a coping mechanism, as a way to there's a lot of relationship between survivorship and alcohol or drug use. But in your research, have you discovered if people are drinking or drugging more before they engage in violent behavior? So I'm actually looking at the offender part of it, and then we can talk about the victim or survivor part of it too. What are your thoughts about that? Kind of which comes first?
Reciprocal in some way, I think. We definitely know that people are more likely to be violent when they're acutely intoxicated by alcohol, right? We now have, and Greg was one of the first people to show this, in his work, and we've shown this in men and women arrested for domestic violence, young adults, college students, um, a whole host of populations. And it kind of makes sense when you drink, you tend to focus on really effective, emotionally salient things that are going on. And so if you're in an argument with a partner or you're very angry and you're drinking, it's going to amplify that, and it's going to make you more likely to be violent. On the other side, if you are a victim of violence, we definitely know that some people will use alcohol or other drugs to try to cope and suppress the trauma that they're experiencing. And that's pretty well known, not even from violence, but folks who are, in war zones, or veterans who are in wars with PTSD, they're more likely to, use substances to try to cope with that. And so it can go both ways. Definitely, I think when it comes to violence, that alcohol can fuel violence. It can be an aftermath. Things get a little more complicated when you talk about drugs, because different drugs have different physiological effects. But certainly drugs like cocaine, methamphetamine, increase your risk for being violent in a similar way as alcohol.
That makes sense. Yeah.
When we started in this field a long time ago, it was first alcohol. Seems like alcohol is associated. We talk about alcohol in part because it's the most commonly used substance, and also because of all of the substances, it's the one where the evidence is the strongest for a connection with alcohol and perpetration. But it started off just looking at, hey, we felt like we were getting pretty sophisticated when we showed, hey, that people were 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 12, 15 times more likely to be physically violent on a drinking day relative to a non-drinking day, or a heavy drinking day relative to a non-drinking day. And then we started broadening that up and saying, well, we don't just care about physical, we care about psychological and sexual too. And then we started thinking, well, we don't just care about violence on a drinking day. One of the things that I think Ryan is such an expert at is and that we've really, where our work is focusing more on now, is for whom, under what circumstances, with which background characteristics. And Michael, you're talking about trauma too. And this is all like a chicken and the egg kind of thing, right? Where people who have histories of trauma, they often turn to substances to mask the trauma, to cope with the trauma. It's maybe not the best coping skill, but at the same time, it's just so debilitating and upsetting and horrifying that they sometimes turn to alcohol to cope. And then their judgment is impaired, and they're more likely to be aggressive. And then, as we've talked about already, aggressive people, like aggression tends to elicit aggression. And so I may, my trauma may be one of the background factors that increased my risk of drinking, that increased my risk of perpetration, that also increased my risk of further victimization. And victimization in terms of physical aggression from a partner, but also emotional aggression and poor relationships, and that fuels my depression. And I mean, you can just sort of see how these things can really snowball. We recognize how incredibly complicated it is, but our goal is to, one study at a time, start chipping away so that we can increase our confidence about who, under what circumstances, will show what behavior, and then we'll be targeting interventions about how can we help who, under what circumstance, with what background characteristic, will be most likely to benefit from what intervention.
It's a really great way to say it. And, you use a lot of words which are really great because it really paints the picture. But I mean, in a lot of systems, people talk about, oh, it's a cycle of violence. Well, I mean, what you just described is like the cycle of what happens. It's like one thing leads to another thing, leads to another thing. I really am attracted to the adverse childhood experiences kind of models of thought. And it's like, hey, when kids see their parents or guardians drinking or drugging or acting in certain ways, how does that affect them? And what do they grow up to? And, and we know some of that based on research, and so it's like, that's different than the research that you're doing now, but like all of that contributes to the body of what we know now.
Michael, there's decades of research showing, right? If you lived in a household where your parents or guardians were violent, you are more likely to be violent in your adult relationships, right? Many explanations. The easiest is social learning, right? We learn by viewing what other people do, and if we're kiddos viewing people being violent, we start to maybe think that's an acceptable way to handle conflict. And then when you add alcohol on top of that, things can get really dangerous. And so, yeah, it we it's more complex than just alcohol, right? Like not all violence involves alcohol. Physical violence, like maybe it's a third to two-thirds. The research is kind of mixed there on how many physically violent acts involve alcohol, but it's in our mind, we know we can reduce drinking, so it's a prime target to reduce violence by reducing drinking. But there's a whole host of reasons why violence might happen.
Michael, you were talking about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and ACEs is an infinite field in and of itself because, one of my students did this really interesting project where we had thousands of undergraduates reporting on their ACEs. And what she was trying to look at was, well, there's the type of ACE, right? What kind of ACE was it? Adverse childhood experience was it? There's the timing of ACEs, right? Like, does an ACE that happens before you're 5 impact you more or less than when you're in middle childhood or when you're an adolescent? And by the way, how do you determine what cutoff to use when you're even looking at the developmental period of time when an ACE might impact? And then, all ACEs are not created equally. So, we both might have a substance, a parent who misused substances, but the difference between your parents and my parents might be just so dramatic and maybe so different in terms of its impact. And so it just kind of highlights how difficult this research is, because even though in our study we're looking at ACEs and minority stress and alcohol and how that might impact aggression, in order to just assess ACEs well, truly, we would need each person to spend a whole bunch of hours just on ACEs. And we'd also need a sample of perhaps tens of thousands of people, because what we really want to know is under what circumstances. And well, it depends on your developmental time period, the severity of the ACE, and so it's murky. It's murky, but we just are doing the best that we can in the time that we have, because of course resources are finite, and our research participants only are willing to give us so much of their time before they actually have, to live their lives.
Well, and you bring up, so much about like, we can only learn so much from each study or what builds on each study. And, the good part is that people are building off of things. I mean, the original ACE study was in what year? It's been many, a couple decades now. Out of Kaiser, but like, how many people have built off of that initial research and added components to it and looked at those variables. So for folks that are listening, if you don't know about adverse childhood experiences, it's an easy Google search. And, Greg, you just shared, a lot of those nuances that people don't have to pay attention to those, but they might feel good about seeing like what some of those things are. And like, oh, maybe that explains a little bit about why I am the way I am, or why some of the physical things that are happening in my body are happening, because those physical things are related to what happens in childhood for some people. So, we can learn from those things.
There are certain things, there's not a lot of things, but there are certain things that psychologists, social workers can be pretty good at. And one of them is treating people with trauma histories. And I just want to give some hope to some of the listeners out there that if they have had, whether it's ACEs or whether it's a traumatic experience as an adult, that I beg you not to suffer in silence, that We have empirically supported interventions. That is, there are psychological treatments that are incredibly effective that will help to make your listeners better. And I just beg them to have the courage. I know it takes a lot of courage, but I also believe that your listeners have the courage. I mean, just the fact that they're tuning into this podcast suggests that they have an interest. And I just want to beg those folks to get connected to a treatment provider who can give them some kind of trauma-informed care, because there are benefits and your life can be better.
Yeah, and thank you for saying that, because I think that that's, one of the foundations of men healing is recognizing that healing can happen, that people don't have to live and suffer for their whole lifetime because something happened, whether that something was 15 minutes or years and years of trauma, and that yeah, there's some tried and true methods that really do work well, but not everything works the same for every person. But thank you for reminding folks that yeah, if you can take that step, we got some good things going on in some professions that are helpful to folks. Um, you both mentioned kind of the what drugs may have different effects, and I was thinking that when we looked at when we look at the 60s, the 1960s, when people were the hippie age of marijuana was like the drug of choice, maybe more so than alcohol. Was there less intimate partner violence when people were chilling back with a smoke? um was there possibly more violence when things moved to cocaine, crack, heroin? What's happening now with fentanyl? What's happening now in states that are legalizing marijuana? Is there any change that you're seeing in research that shows that there's differences both in what drugs people are using, but also in that time zone of when certain drugs were more popular?
Yeah, I mean, I think the research in say intimate partner violence or sexual assault um, really didn't take off until after the 60s, right? And so there's decades of just no information, and my initial thought is no, we haven't seen a change, say, in levels across time. If anything, I think we're seeing higher levels over time, which maybe is just a reflection of the fact that we're better at researching it and we know the questions to ask. Um, and so, if we're seeing a higher prevalence, it's because we're getting more sophisticated in our understanding of the problem. Um, you know, I I'll take cannabis as an example. Cannabis is a really interesting one because there is this perception of someone uses cannabis and they just kind of relax and chill out. But like a lot of drugs, not everybody reacts the same way to the drug, and so there's less research on cannabis um, because it's um, the highest classification for drug use by the federal government, so it's a little harder to study. It's becoming easier because it's more widespread and states are legalizing it, but there's definitely some research out there to suggest that cannabis may increase risk for violence for some people, particularly sexual forms of violence seem to be particularly um, elevated for some folks. Um, but it's so hard to know because cannabis is so different, whether it's legalized and dosing. And I think it's a really, really important question to research, but really hard to research um, because um, it's tough for some folks to know how much they're using, what they're using, and then ethically, you can administer cannabis in a lab setting, um, but there's so many federal restrictions around it.
And also with marijuana, right? Like there's not so much of a withdrawal from marijuana, but there is some of the theory about, we wrote a manuscript a long time ago on the association between marijuana and partner violence. And, part of the question was, is it related? And it was, like there was a relationship there for sure. But the question was sort of why. right? Is the relationship. This is less about the, are you more likely to be violent on a pot use day than a not pot use day? But it was, is the association um, because there's a third variable going where, like it could just be that people who use marijuana, and especially back then, before it was legalized, but I suspect even now there's some uh, association between antisocial characteristics and pot use. No, I'm not suggesting that people who are using marijuana are antisocial in any way, but I'm just sort of saying that like there are certain characteristics of people who would who use marijuana relative to not, or even when it comes to acute effects, there could also be withdrawal effects because if you have a heavy pot user who runs out, they may not be they may have more irritability, and then I think there's not a ton of research on this either because there's not a ton of use, but we have some data that showed that people were more likely to be violent on cocaine use days. And that kind of makes more sort of theoretical sense because of the stimulant properties of it. But I still go back to what we're doing together that I think is so neat, which is it's really, I think so much of it's, under what circumstances for whom, right? And I mean, even alcohol use, right? There's all this evidence that alcohol increases the risk. But if you're in a relationship with high satisfaction and low conflict and low minority stress and low ACEs, low trauma, it may actually be that alcohol decreases your risk, under certain circumstances. So it's a tricky, complicated kind of question.
So I was thinking about the tools that you all develop in research, and I know we've talked about this in the research that we've been doing together about, like, sometimes it's really good to use like the tried and true measures, and sometimes you need to adapt them if they don't work anymore. And when we were talking about adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, one of the original pieces of language was, did you grow up in a household where the mother was abused? So again, it goes back to our beginning conversation of like, the man is abusing the woman. And now that language is changing a little bit. So I'm curious about like how that language has changed, but in the research that you're doing, whether it's on college campuses or with adults, are you having to design different tools to look at IPV that's not in that heterocentric man against woman framework?
Well, one thing we've done, and I agree with a lot of these measures that we've given they've often were developed and used he, she pronouns as an example. And so one thing we've done is, just change it to your partner or them or they and tried to be more inclusive, definitely. The ACEs is a great example of, that item needs to be changed to. Did you grow up in a household where one parent or guardian, right? Not everybody grew up with parents either. And mothers can be violent too, and fathers can be violent too, and grandparents and siblings, right? And so, I think this, and a lot of this comes from our participants in our community, the community of saying, this didn't apply to me, right? Or you're missing this. And so we get that feedback and take it to heart. And there's been some really great, one thing, I'll say this, one thing that I'm not good at is developing measures, because it's a whole field of science that's really complicated. But there's folks who are doing it, and so there's folks who have developed inclusive measures of violence, inclusive to all types of relationships, and measures that are getting at different types of abuse that weren't studied, like identity abuse, right? Using language or hurtful behaviors that target a partner's identity, whether that's their gender or their sexual orientation or their race or ethnicity, as a form of abuse. And so I think we're getting pretty good at that, and we've worked with you so much, Michael, and your folks at Forge on making our measures more inclusive. So I feel like that's a bright spot in the research that is getting better, that we're getting to be more inclusive.
It harkens back to when we started working with you, Michael, and what we started with when we were just, talking about some basic demographic questions was we were taking, like, when we came to you, we had Ryan, you correct me if I'm wrong on this, but we had what we thought to be the state of the art, like, this is the way that we should assess demographic characteristics, at least as recommended by the field, in that cross section in time. And I remember learning so much from one of our early conversations together, where you shredded it and said, this is no apologies, right? This is exactly what we need, right? Is you're like, look, I get why they did that, but that's just so outdated already. And some of the questions you even said, were insulting. And like, the last thing we as researchers want to do is to insult our participants and make them not even want to get onto the second questionnaire because they're still angry with us about how we asked about gender identity or sexual orientation or anything else. And so it's important to have these kinds of conversations with people who are in the field and in the know.
I think it shows a lot about the two of you that care about community partnerships, care about, what is it like for like folks with an overused phrase of lived identities or in communities rather than just sticking in the researcher kind of bubble. And I think that that's one of the harms. And we've talked about this before, but just the harms of like researchers that just only talk to other researchers. Well, where does that end up going? And it's kind of like what we talked at the beginning about, like, well, how does that knowledge get out in out into the world? How do tools get changed or shaped if the only people are just the same little group of folks? But I appreciate your openness to saying, hey, let's learn about this together. Let's figure this out. And I think research would be a lot better and people would be participating more if there was more of that collaborative effort.
We know violence prevention, which is often based on bad language and outdated measures. Folks don't think a lot of these programs apply to them, right? They're for a very small subset of the population based on incorrect assessment of what we think the problem is. And so if we don't get the basics right, everything else from there is just, it's not going to work, right? The foundation isn't set. And so, every time we start a new study, now we come to you saying, how can we make this better? Let's look at our measures and our language. But any community partner, do these questions seem relevant for the folks that you work with and what you see? And if not, we're doing everybody a disservice by just, if we ignored it and said, oh, this is what academics do. That doesn't advance. It doesn't advance public health. It doesn't advance anybody's interest other than our own. And that's a bad way to do research.
And both of you have a lot of humility and a lot of compassion and a really different view than a lot of folks that do research. So thank you for being you, because I don't think that that's true across the board. I've been asking everybody about kind of the tagline of this podcast series, which is let's listen, let's learn, let's heal. When you hear let's listen, let's learn, let's heal, what comes to mind? What do you want to share about that?
I mean, I go back to what Greg said a little bit ago. There's hope and there's ways to heal, right? That I think healing is possible. And, healing doesn't necessarily mean everything's going to magically get better, right? Like, healing is hard, but it can be done. And I've been thinking throughout this, and we were talking about violence, that John Kabat-Zinn, who's a very well-known mindfulness person, is known for saying at any given time there's more right with you than wrong with you. And so when I think of healing, Like you're starting at a place where there's more right with you than wrong with you. Um, Everybody has things they can heal from, and it's okay to get help. And then if I work backwards from that, learning or learn, right, we can learn from each other. You're not, no one needs to go at healing alone. And sometimes healing alone is okay, and sometimes healing with others is what's needed.
So, I mean, every Tuesday I go to a substance use treatment facility and work with residential patients to help them piece their lives back together. And there is hope, right? And for a lot of them, part of what got them into treatment was a sort of calamitous, catastrophic event in their lives. But we have ways of helping people, and I view treatment as sort of a um, maximally as possible a judgment-free zone where we are there to help elicit uh, change. I'm looking at Ryan's shirt now, right? Be the change. Um, and we wouldn't have gone into this field if we didn't firmly believe that change is possible. And we are also researchers and can tell you that there is a mountain of evidence for certain psychological issues for which the, the treatments are quite helpful, quite effective. And we really want to encourage men to go get help, and you're not alone.
Yeah, perfect answer too. And yeah, we will add some links in the captions or whatever it is underneath the videos, and we can chat a little bit about what those will be offline, but we can definitely add some of those resources. Is there anything else that either of you would like to add that we didn't talk about that feels like a burning, like I need to say this before we log off today?
I think I'll just say, this is the right podcast, Men Healing Podcast, and I think society kind of says, right, men who seek help or need help, they're kind of viewed as not masculine enough, right? You're supposed to tough it out, and I just can't think it's further from the truth. One of the hardest things anybody can ever do is seek help, right? It's hard, um, and you owe it to yourself to seek help if you need it.
I'll just end in gratitude.
It was a really, really beautiful time to spend with both of you, and hearing about the work that you do and the way you conceptualize things. So thank you for spending an hour of your time and energy and love and all of the things that you bring with you to this conversation. And thanks to the listeners today that are tuning in. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Just Healing. Join us for new episodes throughout 2024, where we will continue to spread messages of hope and healing, and welcome Just Healing's two other new co-hosts, Dr. Greg Kaysen and Jace Barron. It's going to be an exciting year. And remember, you are worthy, you are loved. Trauma doesn't define any of us. Healing is possible, and it's a collective journey. This podcast was produced by Dr. Deborah and me, Michael Munson, in collaboration with Men Healing, a national nonprofit organization dedicated to helping provide accessible resources and community for any male or masculine identifying individual who has experienced sexual harm. You can donate, check out our healing events, videos, and other resources at menhealing.org. If you or someone you know has been a victim of or experienced sexual harm and you need to talk to someone, RAIN can help. Call their National Sexual Assault Hotline to speak with a trained staff member who can provide you with confidential crisis support. It's free, it's confidential, and it's available 24/7. You can call 1-800-656-4673, or you can go to their web-based chat support. You can reach it at hotline.rain.org. That's HOTLINE.RAINN.org.